Thanks for joining us. My name is Annika, and I'm a growth and relationships manager at Stewardship. And if you're not familiar with Stewardship, we are the only Christian donor advised fund in the UK. It's a charitable giving platform, helping Christians to give well and charities to receive well, and all with the aim of supporting kingdom work in the UK and internationally. And in my role, I do a lot of communicating around biblical generosity. And I wrote a piece for the December edition of Faith and Business Quarterly about how operating in a spirit of generosity is key to practicing just grace, forgiveness, and accountability in the workplace. And so today's topic is just grace in overcoming obstacles. And the question that we're asking is, what are the inhibitors of just grace in the world of work, and how can we overcome them? Jesus makes grace a matter of the heart, which gives us hope because our ability to navigate with our minds, how best to exercise justice, grace, and forgiveness and accountability and all these things is limited in complex situations. And in the end, what we need goes beyond reason. It's supernatural. And if we love God, it's about love. If we love Him and we love our neighbors as ourselves, then Jesus tells us that we meet all of God's demands. But of course, love can be difficult. But love is a secret to flourishing institutions and Christians, including in their work, have a beautiful opportunity to really work out the love of God in their various spheres of influence. So. It's love, it's grace, it's accountability, but God also provides forgiveness. So God's justice is gracious, His grace is just. How then can we help each other through God's rich resource of love to overcome whatever hinders in our work and the free flow of just grace? So that is kind of the summary of the topic today. We'll hear from our two panelists momentarily, but I just wanted to offer some of my own thoughts as well as we begin. Human nature and the reason for why people behave the way we do, is often very complex and can involve dysfunctional patterns of relationship and undealt with pain, self-defeating coping mechanisms, etc. And it can also involve fairly familiar dynamics like competition and envy and lack of trust and lack of team cohesion, bad communication, which leads to misunderstanding and leads to kind of scattered outcomes. And this is true in work. This is true in life. This is also true often in the church. And I think that one of the best ways to overcome these things is by operating in a spirit of generosity. That is of another world. That is, supernatural. It's heavenly. It's of God's kingdom. And if we don't operate in a generous spirit, we will likely not be quick to forgive. We will likely be quicker to pursue accountability, but perhaps not from a place of love and grace. And it is this grace that will encourage reconciliation to happen, and for God's kingdom to enter places where shalom is lacking. So I think generosity is a key to much of what we're going to be talking about today. And one final reflection, I think, God is generous to His core. He created this spectacular world. He handed it over to us to steward, and despite our grievous failings, He's not sought to take back that control. He's still letting us have dominion over the earth. He's still asking us to make it flourish and to be good stewards. And that's staggering, when we really think about it. And of course, not to mention Jesus' incredible, generous act on the cross. And we're now in a season of Lent, which is a great time to contemplate this generosity and its implications for how we go about showing generosity in the form of forgiveness and grace to others. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to invite them to share their thoughts. Andy Nunn loves connecting people to God and each other, and he combines a business nous with a pastoral heart. He does this through business like Barclays Investment, where he led the Christian workplace group whilst preventing rogue trading and planting a cafe church. He does it through charity by helping found a workplace charity called Bread of Hope that feeds the body, mind, and soul of London through courses such as Forgiveness at Work. He also set up a social enterprise for ex-offenders in a church in East London called Second Crack Coffee. Andy has a master's degree in economics from Durham University and consults for the government in a variety of places, from the Home Office to UK Space Agency and Defence Science and Technology Laboratory to governmental digital service alongside businesses and charities. He's also finishing a master's in counseling at Waverley Abbey College and is a part of the leadership team of his local church. Sara-Louise Martin is a passionate problem solver and a connector of people. She is the Europe and MENA Director, that's Middle East and North Africa, Director of Faith-Driven Entrepreneur. And she's also the co-founder of Impact Central, which is an accelerator, angel network, and impact fund that scales impact-driven startups. She was recently recognized with an award as one of the top 100 women of impact, called WISE 100. She's previously co-founded a UK charity providing support to women caught up in modern slavery. And outside of work, she's an avid reader and loves gathering people together. On a Saturday morning, you'll find her with a coffee in hand after cold water swimming. So I will have Andy begin, and he will hand over to Sara-Louise. And as Stephen said, please post your questions in the chat for the Q&A after their talks. Right, Andy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Annika, for that great intro. I don't know about you, but I can often see a broken world around me lacking accountability and forgiveness. It really angers me as there is an alternative being just grace. As Annika mentioned, we've been thinking about what inhibits just grace in the world of work and how we can overcome them. I feel personally it can often be my pride wanting to get justice myself rather than releasing that to God. Sometimes I haven't had the courage to challenge, and God has reminded me of Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Often I have challenged and been ignored and hear the enemy's lie. They won't listen to you. Why bother? I remember many years ago when I used to work for a church and hadn't filled out my prison paperwork, despite saying I had. This really weighed on my conscience, so I got to work early one day to ask for forgiveness from my boss. I told her about how I'd been beating myself up about it. She looked at me and said, well, that's not going to help your self esteem. You instead need to love yourself and learn from this. But there were consequences. I couldn't actually do prison ministry in the prison that year, but God did open up an opportunity later that year to work with guys who had just come out of prison. I try and model those principles now, not beating yourself up about it, but forgiving yourself and learning from this. Jesus makes it clear grace is a matter of the heart. We often find ourselves in complex situations, and what is needed goes beyond reason, love. God's justice is gracious, just as his grace is just. How then can we help each other through God's rich resource of love to overcome whatever hinders in our work, the free flow of just grace? I find hanging out with those who forgive even the hardest things helps my forgiveness muscles grow. I've got some friends called Ray and Vi. Their son was brutally beaten to death by a gang in London many years ago. It took time and healing, but they decided to forgive those who did this because that's what Jesus would do. They even met their son's killers in prison so the killers could know the impact their actions had on their whole family's life. When those guys came out of prison, they bought them new tools so they could start life afresh with a new trade. They even passed on the wisdom to make the tools look not so new, so people wouldn't realise they were the new boys on the block. This, I really believe, is going the extra mile and takes massive courage. I've been with Ray and Vi to countless prisons, and the reason they keep going is because they want to leave a legacy that outlasts them of forgiveness. They don't want their son's life to have been taken in vain, and they've walked alongside many other victims and helped them on this forgiveness journey. This isn't without cost. They've given up jobs, lots of early mornings and late nights, but they know this is what they're called to. I don't know about you, but I've been stabbed in the back by a boss who I thought was a Christian. I've had staff steal from me. I've had an employer wrongly dismiss me. And I've had a business partner run off out the country, leaving me in a terrible situation that took years to be rebuilt. I've had suppliers not hold up their side of the agreement and buyers let me down. I've had a colleague who's going to move in with and church plant with cheat on his girlfriend with mine and tell me that on the day of my dad's best friend's funeral. All of these things have really hurt. And I've had to process this rather than stay in that victim mentality. I've had to pray to God to give me his heart for these people, for the strength to keep forgiving them. This wasn't easy at all. I even felt God telling me to stay at the church where I'd been cheated on for a season. I felt God wanted me to stay in right relationship with them. And testament to that, I was even invited to their wedding. Don't worry, I felt I could decline that invitation. I had a choice. Do I let unforgiveness take root? Because I have done at points for a while, and it didn't work out for great for me. I wish I hadn't taken so long to uproot it. Now I've got another choice. Do I just become a walkover? Looking at Jesus, he forgave even at the cross, as they didn't know what they were doing. But he wasn't a walkover. He turned over the tables in the temple. He challenged with compassion the woman at the well who was living with someone who wasn't her husband. Some people might think it's not loving to challenge. Let's look at it from another lens. If your 12-year-old daughter stole your debit card and spent £500, would you not challenge her? If she was getting texts from an unknown numbers asking for nudes, would you not challenge that? And my question would be, if you're not challenging, why not? As for me, I would challenge them because of my love for them. So why don't we forgive more and challenge more in the workplace? How much do we really love our bosses, employees, suppliers, buyers? As God even says we should love our enemies. And what does love look like? Well, I think 1 Corinthians 13:4-8 puts it quite well. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy or boast, it is not arrogant or rude, does not insist on its own way, it is not irritable or resentful, it does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. So I think my time's up. So I'm going to now hand over to Sara-Louise to give us her thoughts.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be with you all today. And I just want to say that I'm going to focus on 4 main points during our short time together. So what is really behind the spirit behind justice and grace? What does the Bible say about both of those topics? And then linking that to the workplace, what really prevents us from showing up as carriers of just grace, and how might we overcome those barriers that exist both in our minds and in our hearts when it comes to exhibiting just grace in the workplace? And just as as Andy has shared some examples of how a lack of justice and grace has showed up in his own life. And that's been very similar for me as well. And it's been the theme of life for me from a very young age, growing up as the daughter of a murdered RUC officer by the hands of the IRA. That's been a wild ride and an accelerated course in living your faith when the rubber hits the road. And so there have been many things since then that have broken my spirit, including lots of things that have happened in the workplace. But I just want to focus firstly on the spirit behind just grace. We have, as Andy has also shared, we have the actual blueprint to what human flourishing looks like. It goes against everything that the world says to be successful. Yet, when we're caught up in the ways of the world and doing our work to the best of our ability, it can be so easy to set down that truth in the hustle and bustle of working life. And having a foundation of grace, knowing that there's nothing that we can do to make God love us more or less, how does then that show up in how we treat others and work with others in the work that we're doing? And so when we're not shaped by that, the justice and grace that we extend to other people will be hard instead of healing. And that also leads to legalism. But grace without justice also leads to irresponsibility. And Jesus showed us that true justice and grace flow not just from the mind, but from the heart. And so the question that I point to you at this early juncture is, what practices of spiritual formation are integrated into your week that keep you focused on the posture of your heart? And so I just want to move then to, what does the Bible say about just grace? It talks a lot about God's justice is gracious and his grace is just, and how Jesus was the perfect embodiment of both, how he confronts sin but offers redemption. We can see that easily as an example with the woman caught in adultery in John 8. The Pharisees were demanding justice. Jesus extended grace, but it wasn't without accountability. Go and sin no more. And so what does that look like within the workplaces when we are wronged, either relationally or at a deeper level when our trust is completely broken? And so just grace doesn't ignore sin, but it actually moves towards restoration. And then how can we develop practices around spiritual formation to meditate and allow God's Spirit to speak to us about how we hold justice and grace in tension? How is Jesus inviting us to extend grace while upholding truth? And then the third point, what prevents us from extending just grace in the workplace? Often it can be a lack of generosity of spirit. It can be because we have been overly generous in the past and we feel that that's been taken advantage of. Without a generous heart, we're often slower to forgive and quick to condemn. But actually, the Bible tells us that we need to pray forgiveness 70 times 7, that this is not something that we do once, but it's something that we have to do repeatedly. And that is something that I have had to learn the really hard way, particularly in the area of what happened to my father at a very early age. But it has allowed me to see the impact of that in the posture of my heart as an outworking in lots of other very difficult circumstances in my own life. I think often we can prevent just grace from fully flourishing because we're afraid that we might look weak. Grace is very risky, particularly when people have wronged us. But the strength of it is rooted in love. And we know that love is the deepest freedom that we can offer anyone. Sometimes we will overly rely on rules instead of prioritizing relationship. That can be easy when we're in the hustle and bustle of things being really, really stressful and fast paced, and we're just wanting to get things done. And I mean, we've all been there, haven't we? Policies, though, can't replace a transformed heart. And grace and justice have to be lived, not just legislated. And so a spiritual formation practice within that is, Sabbath as an act of resistance. What does it look like to really prioritize that in your week? And how does that then help to shape your mind and heart as you think about how you show up in the working world? And then what does it look like to overcome these barriers? We know the Bible tells us that we're to do two things: love God and love our neighbours. And love is really the key to grace being just. And when we have been through experiences where wrongs have been done to us, it can be hard sometimes to assume the best intention of somebody else. But when we step into that place and we are the ones that are extending grace first, then assuming the best allows us to prevents us from enforcing the worst. And how can we hold accountability with love? Again, Stephen shared how that had happened in his own life. But I think the root of that is that correction should really aim for reconciliation and not punishment. How do we then in our workplaces create a culture of generosity? So the more that we give, the more that it flows. And what would that look like in a spiritual practice? The practice of confession. So that humbles us. It reminds us that we too need grace. And before judging our colleagues, how have I needed grace in this area of my own life? And then finally, just grace isn't just about balancing opposites. It's actually about operating in love, and the foundation of all, which is the foundation of all justice and grace. And what would it look like to you, for you to extend that in your work this week? And so as a spiritual formation practice, how often are you having the opportunity to have some silence and solitude? And how is that then shaping how you show up in your day?
Thank you. That was so good from both of you. Plenty to chew on there. Um, so I'm wondering, it's something that you both touched on a bit, but I'm just so, do you have any particular portion of scripture, and you both have mentioned some scripture verses, but is there like a moment or a season in your life that there was a particular scripture that really became a revelation for you in your journey to kind of um, find space for grace to really come alive in your lives?
Yeah, I think the one that springs to mind for me is just around in Matthew where Jesus says, pray blessing on those that persecute you, which is not really terribly normal, nor is it fair. And yet it's something that my mum really modeled so brilliantly to us as we were growing up, that it changes your heart. It changes your heart when you're praying blessing on people that are a real pain in the butt and have spent time have probably spent time um knowingly either do something wrong that's hurtful or as a consequence of their actions. It's not a natural thing, and you don't feel the blessing. You don't feel like when I'm praying blessing, I at the start, it's not like I really believe what I'm praying, but actually it's the obedience of this is what the Bible tells me to do, and I know that God has ordained this because he knows it's going to change my heart and my attitude and a softening of my spirit. And it's the first step in reconciliation when you've been wronged, even when it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. What about you, Andy?
I thank you for that. I think for me, it's been this last few weeks, and the verse has been Micah 6:8, which Stephen put
Mm.
on the email. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And for the last couple of weeks, I've been in and out of hospital with my 13-day-old son. He's been in hospital more than he's been out. And we've had some great experiences and we've had some awful experiences. And a bit like Sara-Louise was saying, actually, how can I be a blessing to those around me, whether it's the staff who are probably overworked, underpaid, don't have the resources they need? How can I be a blessing to the other people in the ward who are having similar challenges, whether it's giving them some extra nappies when they're short or, yeah, praying blessing over them? And my son's name is actually Micah. And
Mm.
this is his life verse, and Stephen didn't know that or that kind of thing. So just, I pray this over him, but I also pray this over myself because when you have a new child, it's a bit like those long transatlantic flights that just never come to an end, and you don't know when you're going to get that sleep back, and you don't have as much patience and the rest of it, and it's just yeah, asking for forgiveness for when you are a bit short with people, but also trying your hardest to do what God has called us to do, which is to love those around us. But also that hasn't stopped me from like feeding back some of the challenges to the matrons and doing it in a way that I know this is really hard for you. I'm not doing this just to be annoying. I'm doing this because I don't want others to have this experience. And actually, by doing it in that way, they've kind of thanked me and even said, you'd be great helping us improve stuff here because you've been able to articulate it in a clear way that we can actually do something about. And I think sometimes, yeah, we can be maybe, yeah, not bold enough to actually challenge some of the wrong that is going on.
That's really good. Thank you. I'm thinking about the connection like between love and fear and how they're opposites. And there's Sarah Menard wrote in the comments here, um, talking about love is that fearless muscle that moves our body, soul, and spirit to extend grace. So like you were saying, you have to exercise that muscle. It is something you have to decide and make part of your spiritual practice. Um, and so I'm just thinking of a time when I feel like I was really released in having grace for others because I had a profound revelation of how much God loved me, and that released me from fear, which then, of course, um, enables me to extend grace, but also challenge without fear. Is there a moment that you can kind of think back to that where you had kind of a revelation for yourself of how much God loved you, and what was that like? Like, what was the not the fallout, that's the wrong word, but I mean like the kind of the result, the release from that. And if anybody has any questions, please post them in the chat and we'll cover them in a couple minutes that we have left.
I have had a number of really difficult work experiences, and one that springs to mind, I was wrongfully dismissed from a job, or more crudely, was fired by a woman who absolutely loved me for the first 6 months that I worked with her, and then suddenly decided she absolutely did not. And later learned that she had done this to about 15 other people in the organization. It wasn't personal, but it's very hard not to take it personal. And I felt I was discriminated against because of my faith, but also the craziness of that was it set me onto this path that I probably never would have shifted to had that not happened. And I really felt God say, this is your opportunity to do what you actually really want to do and what I've made you to do in the world. So a big chunk of my whole career up until that point had been in financial service, professional services. And then I was released to actually do something that I was deeply passionate about. And the rebuilding of your confidence from something like that can take such a long time. Yet I really felt the Lord that even though there was a lot of uncertainty surrounding it, I felt really clearly like this, this is the way, walk in it, that verse. And it can be really difficult when it's a jolt into the next thing or to the next path, but also it can be a really loving thing from God at the same time, depending on how we choose to interpret it. And so I've tried to be a bit more sensitive to, if there are jolty things happening, okay, well, maybe this is taking me to the next path, even though I still resist them. But that's been my experience of God's love in a way that initially didn't feel terribly loving, but actually has brought so much freedom and so much depth of life in terms of richness, and has put me on a path that I should have been on probably long ago.
Thank you. Andy, do you have any?
Yeah, I do. I think I've had a few experiences of just, yeah, really knowing God's love in different ways. And like, I've got very loving parents who like loved on me when I'd done really stupid things because that's what God has done for them. But I'm reminded I was in this prayer meeting at Barclays and I was complaining to God about how bored I was with my job. And God lovingly challenged me and said, look around at all these other people. They've got more boring jobs than you. Like, kind of in a loving way, kind of suck it up.